Starting the. All right, Roman, thank you so much for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
Hi, Dominic. The pleasure is all mine.
So I guess we'll start off with just the basic question of tell me how you got here, education background, how you ended up at AUP, and the process that got you here.
So I'm Russian by birth, and I immigrated to Israel when I was 10 years old, and I did my law studies there. I chose to study law. And then I was the place to go, even in Israel, to study law is the United States. So I went to do my master's in law at Yale Law School, and then wrote my doctorate there. And my expertise in law is fundamental rights and comparative constitutional law and law and religion. And so I wrote my doctorate on how minority groups, not necessarily liberal minority groups in democracies, treat their children, and how the state and the parents fight over who will ultimately brainwash the children into what they think the children should be when they grow up. And that's how I got to France to do comparative research for my doctorate, because my doctorate was studying what happens in the US vis-a-vis France and Israel. And I came here for a year of research at the Sciences Po, at the Sciences Po Law School, met my wife, changed my plans, my future wife, changed my plans, and decided to stay in Paris. And was teaching at AUP last semester. And then Professor Sawyer and the Center for Critical Democracy Studies got this amazing grant from the Horizon 2020 European Union Fund to study radicalization and de-radicalization processes in Europe. It's a very big project. It's a consortium of 17 countries to which you contributed a lot. It needs to be said. And Professor Sawyer wanted to engage in this project. He asked me if I'm interested in doing this research. I was very interested, primarily because in France, the issue of de-radicalization and extremism is not necessarily justifiably, but directly linked to education. And so this was my link, the legal aspect of the project and the education aspect of the project, which is asking, in the French perspective, what do we do with children so that when they grow up, they don't engage in violence? And that's how I'm here. I'm teaching also 2 courses here, one on the D-Lab on de-radicalization and one on history, law, and society, which is also part of my work and research.
Okay, because that's interesting how that link between fundamental rights and minority groups and all that ties into France, because that was going to be my next question is what's the link between France and how our structures here kind of link into your previous research? What was your PhD in?
In law.
What was
it was in constitutional law and human rights. So I was comparing how different regimes, how France, the United States, and Israel look at parental rights, children rights, and what the state can do or what the state should do to limit them. The classic question being if parents want to leave their children at home, for example, a religious group, or in the French case, take a neo-Nazi family that want their child to be at home so that they don't get brainwashed by all these, crazy liberal ideas of equality and take the child away from the radical ideology of the family. And so this is how it translates into the education question. And so the state is interested in the civic education and the civic collection of values. And the parents, sometimes these are hippie parents who want their child to actually get a better education, less brainwashing, less instilling into, sometimes jingoistic patriotism. And sometimes it's families that we are very wary about, like far right family, extreme right education. And sometimes these are much more difficult questions when you have religious families that do not get enough religious education in school and want to take their children out of school or at least get them another set of values. And then the clashes start. in the US over evolution, in Israel over other questions. In France, it's mostly about the idea of citizenship and everyone having to be part of the bigger whole. And what we are studying this de-radicalization project is how in France, the idea that everyone needs to be part of the public sphere, everyone needs to cooperate together, everyone needs to take part in our Republican project, translates into discrimination of the Muslim minority. More as the French are subject to the mediatization of jihadist terrorism or jihadist violence, the more the government capitalizes on it to impose discriminatory policies. Well, it's a long conversation, but a very interesting topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the DRAD project, I know that it doesn't necessarily focus just on jihadist radicalization, but also far left and far right radicalization. How do those also play into that idea of the French civic culture?
Indeed, and this is, I think, the main advantage of this project. That's why I'm so interested in it, because it does not go into, first of all, it does not buy into the French narrative that the main almost exclusive issue here is the 2015 emblematic, Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, that translated everything into this discourse that is not justified and discriminatory. And the more the French government enacts, so all the recent legal reforms in France only indicate that the obsession is growing over this. In any case, the project is looking also at the reorganization of the radical right in France, which is a big problem in recent years. Not only the assassination, attempted assassinations of Macron, which were more anecdotal, but there's a reorganization, a rise in anti-Muslim, racist, violent acts against the immigrant community here. Anti-Semitic acts is rising. The number of anti-Semitic acts is rising in France in the past decade. And so there is this, not yet an avalanche, but a strong trend of rise in extreme right violence. We are also analyzing the ultra-left that has very different goals and going in very different direction, and is also not violent to the extent extreme right violence is. We are also interested in analyzing the differences and why this is happening, who are these people, and as opposed to the often sounded narrative, especially in politics, that any engagement in an analysis of why this violence rises, political violence rises, that is perceived as some sort of justification and often even as a glorification of violence. We are, as researchers, have the privilege to sit here, disengage from this political, often biased and distorted discourse, and ask these questions and see why this is happening, and see also how we can engage in decreasing violence. What can the government do? What can the civil society do? What can the academia do finally?
Right. And then how does all of your interests, your work with CCDS, how does that cross over with the courses that you're teaching this semester? Do they have any?
So certainly. I think that in general, when you're doing research, everything starts being connected eventually. My relationship with my son affects what I teach. What happens in the French political life, in the American political life, in Israel, of course, affects how I think, how I present the topics we study in classes. And so the de-radicalization democracy lab, of course, is directly linked to this. And this is a great opportunity for us, for Stephen Sawyer and I, to actually think about these things out loud and have a big group of very intelligent students interacting with us on the topic. So since we are still, this is not a fossilized research that we've done already 10 years ago, now just teach. We are now doing this. So this is the research in action. I have students talking about it, asking us questions, engaging in debates from which we learn a lot. So this is really an inseparable part of the project. And the introduction to history, law, and society. Well, so law and society, as you can see, this is a directly linked topic. But even I want to say that even when you teach other things, even when you teach theories, Even when you ask, we are reading, I don't know, Durkheim or Weber, or we are reading natural law theories, and we're reading ancient philosophers, or reading Supreme Court decisions on cases that have nothing to do with radicalization necessarily. We always look at the motives behind actions. We looked at how society reacts to law, what law can do and what is unable to do, but pretends is doing, where the law fails. Maybe just one example. So, talking about, I don't know, prison reforms, for instance. Does prison really deter anyone from committing crime? Who we are sending to prison?
Mm-hmm.
Is there inherent problem of who is ending up there? How we treat them? Do they have rights? Do people radicalize in prisons as a result of our of our relationship to prisoners, etc., etc.? So for me, I think in general, research in academia and teaching is one, sphere that turns into different directions every time you shed light on another angle, and that's what's beautiful about it. That's why I like teaching also.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, really, because I was thinking, I just got through reading a chapter in one of Hans Morgenthal's books discussing ethics, and through the entire chapter, my head went, a lot of times back to DRAD and a lot of the work that you're doing, and looking at ethics from a different perception, and that for one community, whether it's the far left, far right, or a Muslim minority community, your ethics and your values are going to shift, and how you fit in with the ethics of your surroundings is going to change. The French morals and ethics are very much set in stone. They're etched in history in so many ways, and then you have all these different sub-ethical communities, and they all kind of fit in there. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that, and how that
and the social context is very important. So there is a great book that links Hans Morgenthal's philosophy and writing to Hannah Arendt, to Leo Strauss, to Henry Kissinger, because all four of them were Jews surviving second or fleeing one-to-one on the extent or another Nazi Germany, and writing and having an enormous impact on not only foreign relations here in the United States, but also law, but also sociology, anthropology, politics, looking at it from a very contextualized perspective, looking at it from what they lived through. And so what is happening in France right now versus even what's happening in the US today has a very different implications on how these things work, and also on our ethical perception, which is also about law and society, if you will. Well, that's very interesting.
Alrighty. All right, Roman, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dominic. It is my pleasure. Note the hidden commercial I was sneaking here of the AUP Student Association. I didn't even notice.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dominic.
All right.